Well, well, what has the cat dragged in today? It's another video tutorial on Unity. In this one, we are going to continue to take a look at our simple little space game here. Specifically, we're going to implement the logic for losing, colliding into the rocks and this back border here, and winning, which will be a trigger volume that we will set up in this episode. We'll also scatter some rocks in here so that way there's actually some tiny degree of challenge involved. Now, before we get on to the code, a quick reminder. In the last video, we added on a rigid body component to our ship. The reason why we had to add this rigid body on is based on the Unity collision matrix. This collision page is a very important one. And specifically what we're looking at is this collision action matrix. If you have a collider but no rigid body, it is considered to be a static collider. And as you can see here, if static colliders will not give messages to one another because, well, they're supposed to be static and therefore not moving. So Unity will not give them a message. Unity really wants you to have a rigid body on things if you are going to be moving it and you're using their collision system. And so that is why we added a rigid body onto the ship. As a rigid body collider, it will receive collision messages. Talking, it's difficult. If you collide with a static collider, a rigid body, or a kinematic rigid body, we'll worry about kinematic some other day. And that means the message that we are going to be looking for is an on-collision enter message. And part of the location where you can learn that is, again, the mono behavior object. Just like the collision manual page, this is not a page that you have to have memorized, but it's a good page to be familiar with. Because in here, it gives you a list of all of the messages that a component can receive. So anytime you're asking the question, well, how do I know if X happens? This is one of the first places you come to look to see whether or not there is a pre-existing message that a component is going to receive. And sure enough, we can see that there is an on-collision enter message, which is given the very first frame that a collision occurs. On-collision stay happens every frame after the first frame, and on-collision exit is the very first frame that the collision no longer exists. So in our particular case, we want on-collision enter, the very first frame that the collision starts. So I am going to hop over to Visual Studio, and I need to create a new method. It is very important to make sure that your cursor is outside of the curly braces encapsulating the update method. You cannot create a method within a method. So you have to make sure that your cursor is on line 20, assuming that you are matching mine exactly line for line. And actually, for just pure aesthetic reasons, I'm actually going to move my cursor down to line 21. Because I want a line of space between the void update and the beginning of my on-collision enter. So I'm going to start by typing in on collision. And again, IntelliSense autocomplete's going to suggest to me, oh, do you mean on collision enter? Yes, I do mean that. So I'm going to hit tab, and it's going to auto-magically fill in the rest. So private, void, on collision enter, and we pass in a reference to a collision. So this is the other object that we are hitting, which for the baseline of this project, we can completely ignore. We don't actually need to do anything with the other. What we need to do is two things. First, we need to display the you lose message. Now there's two ways that we can get things to the console. The shortcut way is to simply type in print and pass in the message. So print, open parentheses, open quotation mark, you lose, close quotation mark, close parentheses, semicolon. The other way, and you do not need to put in both ways, I'm going to delete out this next line. This is effectively equivalent to doing debug.log and then passing in the message. These two lines here do exactly the same thing. It's just that mono behavior has print defined as a shortcut, effectively. So I do not want the debug log line. So I'm going to do Shift Home twice to select the whole line and backspace out. Oh, and then immediately put the line return back in because I do need one more line. So that'll print the you lose message. But the ship will still be flying around in space. We don't want the player to be able to continue to control the ship after they have lost. I want to destroy the ship. And so, of course, there is actually a method called destroy. Now, what do I pass in here? What I'm going to pass in is this dot game object. This part right here is optional. This is a personal preference of mine of when there are two potential game objects that I can reference, because there is a game object attached to this collision variable. If I've got multiple game objects that I could be referencing, I really like to be very, very explicit as to which one I am referring to, both to assist the compiler and to assist anybody coming behind me and reading my code. You do not technically have to do this. This line of code, oops, that is not at all the correct line. There we go. I thought I had done a Control-X. Apparently I didn't. That was the our school's COVID policy URL, if anyone really cares to go to that URL. But these two lines, destroy this.game object, destroy game object, do exactly the same thing, which is to destroy the attached game object. And that is enough to test. We always assume, whenever you're coding, as soon as we have enough to code, I have no red squiggles of doom, everything compiles, I have a functional thing that I can test, I want to test it. Because if something goes wrong, I know where the error is going to be. It's in the code that I just wrote. So that has been saved. I'm going to switch back over to Unity, let it recompile, twiddle my thumbs for a bit. And hit the play button. Now, what I expect to have happen, if I run into the sides, my ship should disappear, which it does. And down here in the bottom left-hand corner, I see a you lose, or I can switch to the console tab and more easily see that message. Excellent. Stop. Start again, because I want to test the back. Is the back working correctly? Yep, you lose. Excellent. That is precisely what I wanted to see. And there we go. Yep. Clear out those messages. Okay. So that is the expected functionality. If you are not getting this functionality, in other words, you're not being destroyed, a couple of things to check. One, make sure you have no red messages here. You shouldn't have any, because the only possible error message that you really should be getting at this point is compile errors, and you can't even run and test with compile errors. So make sure you fix compile errors, which would be represented as red squiggles of doom in Visual Studio. Second, make sure that you have on collision enter, that your code looks exactly like this. It is on collision enter, and that you are destroying this .game object. Destroy this, which is an uncommon error, but I have seen it before, will not work because you are destroying the component, not the game object. It must be .game object. Another thing to check, if your ship is not being destroyed correctly, is to make sure that you have a rigid body attached to the player's ship. If you do not have this attached, no collisions. Again, remember, static colliders aren't supposed to move, so we have to have this rigid body component in order for the collision message to work. So those are the things to check if your ship is not being destroyed. Now, let's get the victory condition in here. Now, I don't want to use a collider because currently, anything that has a collider on it is going to kill me. So I don't want to die reaching the goal. I want to win. I have successfully navigated the hideous asteroid field, and I want my just rewards. So we got to set things up slightly different. What I'm going to do is I am going to come over here to the hierarchy. I am going to right-click, and I am going to create an empty game object. Empty game objects are your friend. They are so very useful. And I'm going to name this empty game object goal. I'm going to reset the transform. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to manually add onto here a box collider. So I'm going to add component, I'm going to type in box, and I'm going to select box collider. Then what I can do on the size property here, I can stretch it all the way across so that it takes up this entire space here. And then I will drag it forward so that it's just a little bit past this last set of sidewall barrier here. Now, I just got done saying I don't want a collider because a collider will kill me. So why do I have a collider? Well, that's because there's colliders and then there's triggers. There's this convenient little checkbox here, is trigger. Sometimes you're not necessarily concerned about things colliding with each other. You just simply need to know, are these two objects touching? I don't need physics here, game. I don't need any physics going on. I don't need this to stop anything from going through it. I just need to know if something's in it, or if something is in this space or has touched this area. That's all I need to know. And that is when you use a trigger. I don't need collision calculations. I just need to know when the ship has entered this volume. Hence why they're typically called trigger volumes. So by having this checkbox checked, this is now a trigger and will not generate a collision message anymore. I'm just temporarily increase my speed here so I can just zip straight across. This is also why we made this a variable. Oh, whoops. And because I removed and added back in my rigid body, I've got to turn my gravity back off and refreeze my rotations. And I zip across and nothing happens. As expected, that's a trigger, not a collider. All right, back over to Visual Studio. Again, I need to make sure that my cursor is outside of my on-collision enter method. So I'm going to hit enter twice. So now I am on line 27. My cursor is outside of the on collision enter message, but still inside my class curly brace. And I am going to type in on there we go, on trigger enter. So on try brings it up. I'm going to hit tab to have it auto magically completed. Private void on trigger enter, collider other. Notice there's a difference here. One's a collision, one's a collider. It's because there's different information between these two. It's a little bit odd, but it's just something you have to wrap your mind around when using Unity. And actually, I'm going to do almost the exact same logic here for the base version. I'm still going to use print, but instead of printing you lose, oops, nope, that is a lowercase p, not a capital case P. Thank you very much. I'm going to print you win. And I'm still going to destroy the game object. Because again, well, there's two things here. I don't want the player to be able to continue to move after they win. Because what happens if they reach the trigger volume and they continue to move and then they run into a rock and then they lose? So did they win or did they lose? We got both messages on screen. So we're going to tell the player, you win, get rid of the ship, so that way they can't do anything else. They're locked into that win state. That's it. Easy peasy. Make sure the code is saved. We don't want a little asterisk over here. Hop back over to Unity. Let it do its compilation. There we go. Hit the play button. Zoom! And yay, I win! Hooray, huzzah, and other exclamations of excitement. One last thing left to do, and that is to put in some obstacles, because at the moment, this isn't interesting at all. The player can just fly straight across and win. Even for as simple of a game as this is supposed to be, that's a little too simple. So what I'm going to do is I am going to create another empty game object collection here. So in my hierarchy, I am going to right click, create empty. I'm going to call this _ rocks. I am going to reset the transform. And then what I'm going to do initially is just grab a miscellaneous rock. Doesn't really matter which one. I'm going to duplicate it and haul it over into the rocks collection and then move it out into the field. And then I can just duplicate out some rocks to make it a little bit more interesting. And this is the part where I've got to do some very basic playtesting. It's like, is this a good placement for my rocks? So I can easily dodge around that one, dodge around, reach the end. Hooray! I have won. And that's it. Congratulations, you've made a game in Unity. It's a very simple game. Not all that great of a looker, but it is a game. It is a finished product. It is playable. It has a victory condition. It has a loss condition. It is a basic game. Now, there's going to be one video past this one where we put in a few optional flourishes to this. We'll make the rocks rotate around, so that way they are not just perfectly static like this. And we'll also make it so that you can take a hit before being destroyed. And adjust how many lives does the player have. But that will be in the next video. If you've enjoyed this video and you've learned some new things, thumbs up would be appreciated. And if not, Now the thumbs down button is right next to it. Until the next video.